I must tell you that the sweetest sound to a 70-year-old man who's about 80 pounds overweight is to hear himself described as a fresh voice. I have two brief apologies to make to you before I begin. About a week ago, I backed into a tree and knocked my lower teeth loose, so if you have some difficulty with my accent placing it, it's bad driving. That's the accent. And the second apology is that I'm going to work from a script, and I do that for your own protection, because if I begin to ad-lib, who knows, we'll have to lock the doors, you'll never get out of here. I'm reading from the latest work that I've been doing, researching the history and background of forced schooling or compulsory schooling, which is really an identity between Canada and the United States. They're quite similar, even though there are local differences, and the architects of Canadian schooling, the architects of U.S. schooling, were in fact closely allied with one another. The man from whom I first got wind of the real purpose of American schooling was James Bryant Conant, a Mayflower descendant and one of the influential Americans of the 20th century. I'll get to what those purposes are in a little while, but first we have to do some groundwork together, beginning with the matter of boredom. When I was a boy, my granddad told me that bored people are childish people, so not to ever say aloud that I was bored. He said that the obligation to enlighten myself and amuse myself could never be passed off as anybody else's responsibility but my own. And in the area where I grew up, in western Pennsylvania, around Pittsburgh, I can honestly say, no matter how radical it sounds, that not once did I ever hear a companion or an enemy utter the expression, "I'm bored." I didn't hear that said, although I knew the dictionary definition, till I got to New York City, where everybody said, "I'm bored," all the time, every day. I couldn't escape the expression. On that basis, that we're responsible for our own amusement and enlightenment, American secondary schools, North American secondary schools, can fairly be called childish places because they are places of exquisite boredom. Think of school as we have evolved it in the past 100 years, as a laboratory of extended childishness. Then think of the possibility that this might have been done for some rational purpose. As significant as the boredom of young people in schools is, the fact is that teachers in these institutions are bored too. They might not so readily admit it, but boredom is the common condition of school teachers, their low energy, their dispirited speech, and often their whining is the giveaway. If you ask school kids, as I often did, why they feel bored, they always give the same few answers. They say that the work is stupid, that it makes no sense, or that they already know it. They say they want to be doing something real, not just sitting around. The teachers themselves don't seem to know much, and in any case, clearly aren't interested in what they teach. And when you ask teachers why they are bored, they say it's the kids' fault. They say that kids are rude, that they aren't interested in anything except grades, so how can a teacher be interested in them? It's a catch-22, you see. When you look at schools closely, you gradually become aware what childish places they are. How many kids and even teachers are held prisoners there and a childhood they would willingly have left long ago if they knew how, and if the institution had enabled them to escape. Before I continue, let me define my subject here a bit further. Think of a continuum from childlike, that's what we expect young children to be, innocent, trusting, respectful, obedient, anxious to please, and then go all the way across to childish. The palette of childish characteristics includes selfishness, irresponsibility, boredom, envy, inconsiderate behavior, whining, and in general a lack of emotional proportion and self-discipline. Childish people need to be attended by adults. That's important, so don't forget it because it'll come in handy in a few minutes. It's an important clue to what's really going on. Now contrast that childlike to childish continuum with another familiar word, youthful, which offers quite a positive window on human character. Youthful means adventurous, energetic, curious, resilient, indomitable, surprising, open to new experience. Very few schools I've ever seen could possibly contain, let alone encourage, youthfulness. I hope you recognize the paradox in that, an institutional structure which finds itself compelled to suppress those very qualities which are universally acknowledged to be passports of success in Western society. Obviously, we're in the presence of some greater interest or interests which need protection against full self-development on the part of too many to explain rationally why we have the schools we do. Put simply, they can't be the way they are unless it serves some purpose or purposes. They are not expensive accidents. Remember, rationality and reasonableness are two different things. Surely it isn't hard to make the case that our schools are unreasonable by discouraging the ingredients of youthfulness, but that's a far cry from saying they're irrational. You'll see what I mean a little more clearly as we proceed. How many of you knew that secondary school was hardly the only path to maturity until World War II? Junior high school didn't even exist until well into the 20th century, and high school was only a minor part of society until the second quarter of the same century. Now, maybe you think that's progress, but how do you factor this little detail in? Did you know that even today in wealthy Switzerland, less than 1 kid in 4 goes beyond elementary school? Shall I repeat that? In the richest nation in the world per capita, less than 1 kid in 4 goes beyond elementary school. You wouldn't be likely to know that because North America's responsible newspapers, magazines, and media outlets and education schools don't bother to tell you that. And that's a big paradox, wouldn't you agree? For most of our history, kids did not go to secondary school, at least most kids didn't, yet the unschooled rose to be admirals like Farragut, inventors like Edison, captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, presidents like Washington and Lincoln, writers like Melville, or scholars like Margaret Mead, who never saw the inside of a schoolroom. People who reached age 13 were not looked upon as children. Ariel Durant, who co-wrote the well-known History of the World sold by Book of the Month Club, which I guess some of you own because they use it as a premium, was married at 13 to the man she stayed married to for more than 50 years. would she really have been better off doing junior high school homework than starting her life? Was her husband, Will Durant, some form of sexual pervert? Or is there something left out of the story that we've been sold about the proper role of 13-year-olds? If we had a successful system of education before we had universal forced schooling, as the examples of Lincoln, Carnegie, and Margaret Mead suggest, why were these training grounds in boredom that we call forced schooling demanded as a replacement for it? It's a puzzle. But as we track childlike, childish, and boring schools to their origins, we find ourselves back in time about 2 centuries in the northern European nation of Prussia. By 1820, Prussia was teaching the world that schools could be training grounds for obedient political subjects. I'll just step away from the script for a minute to say that the 3 traditional purposes of schooling, wherever it's appeared around the world, still seem reasonable to most people if you present them with the case. The first purpose we could call the religious purpose, to make good people, but in fact there are systems to approach that in the secular world as well. The second purpose is to make good citizens, people that will shoulder the burden of the community, act as leaders, take on responsibility for other people. And the third purpose is that your individual God-given gifts can be developed, can be enhanced in this protected environment. Purpose 1, Purpose 2, Purpose 3. Nothing about creating obedient political subjects, which is the fourth purpose of schooling, and that's the subject of the film I'm trying to make about the history of schooling. It's called The Fourth Purpose, and if any of you have a yen to get on my website, it's just my name with .com at the end of it, and you can read about that film. Anyway, Prussia was teaching the world that schools could be training grounds to be obedient political subjects, and that the mechanism to perform this magic was, not surprisingly, habit training, sensitizing children to be reflexively responsible to propaganda. How well this scheme worked to concentrate state power in that little poor nation up against the North Sea, the world was soon to learn in 3 titanic Prussian wars between 1871 and 1945. I say Prussian wars because Prussia eventually swallowed all of Germany. Beyond its war-enhancing ability, Prussian habit control schools served the emerging mass-production business empires just coming into being as dominant factors in national economies. German psychology early saw that the school could condition children to be susceptible to any sort of authoritarian appeals, including the soft-core authoritarianisms of advertising and public relations. If that were true, then Adam Smith's implacable laws of supply and demand could be repudiated. For if demand could be created for anything or any idea, a managerial revolution was at hand, one which freed managers, including politicians who are, after all, social managers,